I called a plumber in -3 degrees Celsius. He came, fixed the broken pipe, but after a while he left and said to me in a trembling voice, "If you hear 3 knocks from the basement at 3 o'clock in the morning, go down and check. But don't tell your son." At exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, I actually heard the knocks, and I decided to go down and investigate. What I found behind that wall exposed the truth about 512 days of lies. Welcome, thank you for being here. Before we begin, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what would you have done with that message I read, everyone? Note, this is a work of fiction. All characters and events are invented for storytelling purposes only. Subscribe and stay until the end. My name is Edmund Harlow, and I am 71 years old. And I have spent the better part of 4 decades calculating the probability of disaster for other people, which is perhaps why I never once thought to calculate it for myself. The sound that woke me was not the kind you go back to sleep after. A crack from somewhere below, deep and deliberate like the house itself, had finally decided it had held on long enough. I lay still for a moment, the way you do when you are not yet sure if the sound was real or dreamed, and then I heard the water, a low persistent rush beneath the floorboards, and I understood. I was on my feet before I thought to put on shoes. The floor was cold through my socks, the kind of cold that moves upward, that finds your knees and your spine before you have even registered it consciously. The thermostat in the hallway read 31 degrees. Outside December was doing what December does in Salem, pressing down against the windows, indifferent and absolute. Inside, the pipes had finally answered it. I took the flashlight from the nightstand drawer and went down. The basement of 1887 Chestnut Street is original to the house field stone walls, a low ceiling, the smell of a century and a half of New England winters held in the mortar. I have always found it honest in the way old things are honest. It does not pretend to be anything other than what it is. That night, the flashlight beam caught water spreading slow and dark across the stone floor, moving outward from the far wall in no particular hurry. The way trouble moves when it has already decided it has nowhere better to be. I stood at the bottom of the stairs and watched it for a moment. The burst section was visible, a 2-inch copper line along the north wall split cleanly by the frieze dripping in a steady pulse. Repairable, a practical problem with a practical solution. I told myself that. I told myself that more than once. I went back upstairs and picked up my phone. 41 contacts. I had counted 41 contacts in that phone 18 months ago. I know because Maggie teased me about it, said I was the most popular recluse she had ever married. Now I counted 11, and I could not tell you when the others had gone. I stood in the kitchen in the dark and scrolled through the list twice, as though the names might reappear if I gave them a second chance. They did not. Colleagues from the consulting firm, gone. Our neighbors on the north side, the Pattersons who had shared our driveway for 11 years, gone. Maggie's sister Carol, in Portland, gone. My own brother Raymond, with whom I had spoken every month for 30 years, gone. I told myself, people drifted when you were in grief. I told myself they were giving me room. I believed it because the alternative required a question I was not ready to ask. At the bottom of the remaining 11 names, there was one I did not recognize. Arlo Finch, no last contact date, no notes in my own hand. But beneath the name written in a script, I would know in total darkness. In a hand I had watched sign birthday cards and grocery lists, and the deed to this house over 43 years of marriage trust him. Maggie's handwriting. I want you to understand what kind of man I was before that night. I spent 40 years calculating the probability of catastrophe for other people's families. I built careers on seeing risk before it arrived. I sat across tables from executives and engineers and told them precisely where their blind spots would cost them everything. And I had not once turned that eye on my own front door. I put the kettle on, not because I wanted tea, but because I needed something my hands already knew how to do. The window above the sink showed nothing but my own reflection and the darkness behind it. Nolan was in Providence, he had said. A meeting that ran long a colleague's spare room. Vanessa was at her sister's in Gloucester. They had both been gone since Thursday. It was now Saturday 2:40 in the morning, and I was standing in a cold kitchen with a burst pipe below me and 11 names in a phone that used to hold 41. The name on the screen was Arlo Finch. A plumber. A man I had met perhaps 6 times in 20 years. Always when Maggie called him, always when I was somewhere else in the house and came back to find the problem already managed. Why had she kept his number? Why, of every name in a life as full as hers, was this the one she made sure I had? And why had she written those 2 words? Not a phone number, not a note about hours or rates, but trust him, as though she knew a night like this one was coming and had wanted to leave me one clear instruction inside it. I dialed. It rang twice. Not 3 times, not 4, twice, and then the line opened. No sleep in the voice, no confusion. Just a man already awake at 2:40 in the morning, already somewhere near a phone, as though he had been waiting for it to ring. I know the house, Arlo Finch said before I gave him the address. I'll be there by 7. He did not ring the doorbell. I watched from the kitchen window as Arlo Finch climbed out of his truck at 7 in the morning with a toolbox in one hand and the look of a man who had not slept not from insomnia, but from waiting. He walked straight to the side gate, lifted the latch without pausing, and went around to the basement entrance as though the layout of this property was something he carried in his body rather than his memory. A man who knew exactly where he was going, in a house he had not visited in 2 years. I went downstairs to meet him. By the time I reached the bottom step, he had already set his toolbox on the dry section of the floor and was crouched at the burst pipe with a flashlight, examining the split with the focused quiet of someone who has repaired a great many pipes and is not especially alarmed by this one. I stood at the foot of the stairs and watched him work. He wore a canvas jacket salt-stained at the cuffs. His hands were a tradesman's hands, thick-knuckled, unhurried. He worked without commentary, without the ambient chatter most men use to fill a silence they find uncomfortable. The silence in my basement did not appear to trouble him at all. I said, "You found it all right. I didn't give you the address." He did not look up. "Maggie gave it to me, years ago. Said I might need it someday." I let that sit. I did not know what to do with it yet, so I filed it in the place I had been filing things for 6 months, the place I was running out of room in. There is a kind of attention that repairmen develop a professional scan, practical and efficient, moving from problem to problem, the way a doctor's eyes move across a patient in triage. Arlo's attention in my basement that morning was not that. It was the attention of a man reading a room for evidence of something he had already half expected to find. His eyes went to the far field stone wall twice in the first 10 minutes. Not a glance, but a measured look, calibrated and still, before he had touched a single fitting. I had spent 40 years in actuarial and risk work. I knew the difference between a survey and a search. I went back upstairs and poured 2 cups of coffee. When I came down again, he was already cutting the damaged section free with the clean efficiency of someone who has stopped pretending there is any urgency in the repair. I handed him a cup. He took it without breaking his rhythm. We did not talk about Maggie. We did not talk about the 2-year gap since he had last set foot in this house. We did not talk about how I was managing or the estate or any of the usual furniture people arrange between themselves when they have not spoken since a funeral. He asked me twice about the pipe, once about the age of the copper line, once about whether I had noticed pressure changes in the upstairs fixtures over recent months. Both questions were practical. Both had answers I gave him. Then the silence returned, and he worked in it, and I stood in it, and the basement held us both without comment. Let me tell you what I noticed and what I did with it, because I think it matters to the rest of what follows. I noticed his eyes return to the far wall a 3rd time, just before he began soldering the replacement section. I noticed the way he had paused at the bottom of the stairs when he first arrived, not to find his footing, but to orient himself, as though measuring the room against a memory of it. I noticed that he had positioned his toolbox on the floor in a way that kept the far wall within his peripheral line of sight for the entire hour he worked. I noticed all of it, and for the better part of that hour I filed it, under grief makes you read meaning into ordinary things. And I stood there holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold while I watched him instead of drinking it. He had not said her name once. In an hour of working in Maggie's house using the tools she used to watch him use from the top of these very stairs, he had not once said her name. Not, "I was sorry to hear about Maggie." Not, "She was a good woman," as people say. Not even a sideways reference, nothing. As though speaking her name in this basement, in this room, was a choice he had made before he arrived and was not going to revisit. I thought about the annotation in my phone. Trust him. Not call him, not he's reliable, trust him. Written by a woman who used words the way a watchmaker uses tools, with the understanding that imprecision has consequences. Arlo finished the solder, let it cool, ran the line, pressure checked the joints in the right order. Then he straightened, set his wrench into the toolbox with the careful deliberateness of a man buying himself one final moment, and spoke without looking at me. Edmund, a pause just long enough to be intentional. How long has your son been living here with you? Not has he been around. Not how are things between you two. How long has he been living here? The duration to the settled weight of it. As though that number was the thing Arlo had come to know before he said anything else. He went completely still after he said it. The stillness of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has just set it on the floor between you and is waiting to see what you do next. Something in the way he asked it made me understand that the pipe had never been the point. He did not sit. He crouched beside his toolbox the way a man crouches when he has decided to say something he has been carrying for a long time and needs the ground closer than usual. I told him, 14 months. My son had moved in 14 months ago, 3 weeks after the funeral, when I was in no condition to assess anything except whether I had remembered to eat. Arlo nodded once slowly as though the number confirmed something he had already worked out on his own. Then he began. He spoke quietly and without theater. He told me that during a pipe inspection in the autumn of 2022, a job my son had called him in for not me. My son had not once left his side. Every room, every junction, every 5 minutes of work, he had been present with the patient attentiveness of a man who was not interested in the plumbing. Arlo said he had not thought much of it at the time. Some homeowners were watchful, particular about their space. He had filed it and moved on. Then he got to the far wall. He had been checking the north line, the same copper line that failed 2 nights ago, when my son was pulled away briefly by a phone call. In that window of 4 or 5 minutes alone in the basement for the first time, Arlo heard something from behind the fieldstone. 3 knocks, slow, evenly spaced with the kind of interval that told him immediately it was not pipe settling or the house contracting in the cold. 3 knocks as though someone on the other side had heard him moving and was answering back. He came back upstairs. My son was finishing his call in the hallway. Arlo picked up his tools and said nothing. What stopped him from speaking was not cowardice, though I could tell he had decided long ago that it was. What stopped him was a single sentence my son had said. Before the call came and a casual mention slipped into conversation, the way a careful man slips a threat into ordinary language. He mentioned a school by name, a school where a child taught 2nd grade, said in a tone that required no elaboration, needed no follow-up, and left nothing to misinterpret. Arlo had a daughter. My son knew this. The mention lasted 4 seconds. Its effect lasted 14 months. I stood very still while he told me this. I am not certain I breathed through the whole of it. He told me the rest in the same quiet, unadorned voice. 6 weeks before Maggie died, she had come to see him alone. She had not told me she was going. She drove to his shop on a Tuesday afternoon, sat across from him at his workbench, and told him she could not prove what she believed, but that she was frightened. She used that word, frightened. Maggie, who had faced every difficulty of our 43 years together with a composure I had always mistaken for ease, rather than for hard-won discipline, had sat across from a man she trusted and told him she was frightened. I want to tell you, I reacted the way a man should react when he learns his wife spent her final weeks trying to save his life. I want to tell you something clean-arrived grief or fury or love with a clear name. What arrived instead, standing in that basement while the boiler cut out and the cold settled back in around us, was shame. She had known. She had been frightened. She had driven to Arlo Finch because she had no one else she trusted in a city where the names had been slowly disappearing from my phone. And I had held her hand through those final weeks and told her she was imagining things. Arlo had made her a promise. If anything happened, find Edmund. Don't let him reach the end without knowing the truth. Wait for the right moment, not too early. Not when there was still room to course correct, but when there was something real to find. He had been waiting 14 months. He had come today because a burst pipe gave him a reason my son could not question. Then he gave me my instruction. He rose from his crouch and picked up his toolbox. He looked at me for the first time since he began speaking, a direct, steady look, the look of a man transferring something from his keeping to mine. He said, "If you hear 3 knocks from this basement at 3 in the morning, go check. But don't tell your son." 5 words. Don't tell your son. Said without drama, without elaboration, the way a doctor delivers an irreversible finding not to wound you, but because the alternative is to leave you unequipped. Those 5 words rearranged every assumption I had been operating on for 14 months. They meant that the man sleeping 20 feet above my head was not the person I should bring this to. They meant that whatever was happening in this house had been happening with my son at the center of it, and that Arlo had known this long enough to build a protocol around it. I heard his boots on the stairs. I heard the side gate close. I heard his truck turn over and pull away down Chestnut Street until the December air swallowed the sound entirely. Then there was nothing but the basement and the wall and me. I walked to it slowly, not cautiously, but with the measured pace of a man who has made a decision and is simply covering the distance between himself and it. The fieldstone was rough and cold and absolute under my palm. I stood with my hand pressed flat against the newer section, and I counted my heartbeats the way I used to count variables in a risk model, not for comfort, but because counting was the only thing my mind knew how to do with its full attention when everything else had stopped making sense. I did not knock. I stood there for a long time, my hand on the wall, the house silent above me, and I let the shape of what I now knew settle into the space where 14 months of grief had been living. It did not fill it cleanly. Nothing that size ever does. The hardest thing about learning that your life has been a managed fiction is that the kitchen still looks the same. The same coffee maker, the same 4 chairs around the same table, the same window over the same frozen backyard. I climbed the basement stairs and stood in the doorway of that kitchen and understood for the first time in my life what it means to be in a room that is simultaneously familiar and completely destroyed. I sat down. I did not know what else to do with myself, so I sat down. The coffee from the morning was still on the counter, cold in the pot. I poured a cup I did not drink and held it in both hands because my hands needed something to do, while the rest of me began the work of reassessment. 40 years of risk analysis. 40 years of looking at data and finding the shape inside it. I turned that instrument on the past 6 months, and I let it run. The neighbors to the north, the Pattersons, they had stopped coming by in early February. Tom Patterson had knocked on the door twice in January after the funeral, the way a good neighbor does, and then stopped. I had told myself he was giving me space. Now I asked myself a different question. When did Nolan move? In late January. 2 weeks before Tom Patterson's visits ended. I had not connected those 2 data points because there was no reason to. There is never a reason to until there is. I want you to understand what it feels like to be a careful man who has been careless about the one thing that mattered. It is not dramatic. It does not arrive like a wave. It arrives the way a diagnosis arrives quietly in a room you thought was safe, in language that reorganizes everything you believed about the past year without changing a single fact. The facts stay exactly where they were. It is only your interpretation of them that falls apart, and the fall is very quiet, and there is no one in the room to hear it. I began to work through the list in my head. Not the phone contacts I had already seen what had happened there, but the faces. The people who used to be in my weeks and then were not. My colleague Bernard Chisholm, who had called every month for 20 years to argue about retirement projections, had stopped in March. His last call had gone to voicemail. I searched my memory when I was at a doctor's appointment Nolan had scheduled. I had meant to call Bernard back. I never had. I had told myself I would do it when I felt more like myself. I had told myself that for 9 months. When did I last speak to my sister? October, I thought, and then I pressed harder, because thinking is not the same as knowing. She had called, and I had let it go to voicemail because Nolan said I seemed tired and should rest. I called her back the next day. She did not answer. I tried twice more over the following week. I told myself she was busy. Margaret Harlow's sister, who had called her every Sunday for 40 years, who had called me every month after Maggie died, just to make certain I was eating. When was the last time that woman was too busy to return 2 calls? When did that ever happen? Before Nolan moved. His suitcases into the guest room on the 23rd of January, I got up from the table and found a notebook in the drawer by the phone, the kind Maggie used for grocery lists. Spiral bound the paper slightly rough. I sat back down and I began to write. I wrote every name I could remember, the approximate month the contact had gone quiet, the explanation I had accepted at the time. I wrote in the small, precise hand I use for work documents because this was a work document now. This was the only kind of work I knew how to do. I wrote for a long time. 23 names. That was how many I had before midnight, and I stopped only because I had reached the edge of what I could recall with confidence, not because the list was finished. 23 people who had been woven into my life and were no longer in my phone or my weeks, each one with a clean, reasonable explanation, each disappearance falling inside a window that began in late January and ended in August. I am a man who has spent 40 years calculating the probability of unlikely events. I understand what a cluster means. I understand what a pattern with a non-random shape means. 23 is not coincidence. 23 is not grief, and it is not drift, and it is not people giving a widower room. 23 is a campaign. Someone had been building a wall around me, one removed contact at a time, and I had stood inside it and called it loneliness. The medication bottles were by the sink as they always were. I looked at them the way I had been looking at ordinary objects all day with the new eyes that Arlo's words had given me. Eyes that could no longer see anything in this house as simply what it appeared to be. Small brown plastic bottles. My name on the labels. Prescribed by a doctor I had met once referred by Nolan 6 months ago. I left them where they were. I sat back down at the table with the notebook and the 23 names, and I did not move for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. The floorboards settled in the cold. The clock on the wall moved in its usual direction. At 2:47 in the morning, I looked up and realized I had been counting down without knowing it. The hour was almost here. Something below me had been waiting for it. Now so was I. They came at exactly 3, not 2:59, not 3:01. 3 knocks at 3 o'clock, as though whatever was down there had been keeping time. I felt them before I heard them, a vibration that moved up through the chair legs and into my thighs, through the table and into my forearms where they rested on the notebook. The sound followed a half-second behind, deep and deliberate, rising through the kitchen floor itself. Not from the direction of the basement stairs. Not from the far wall where I had already looked. From directly below me, through the structure of the house, through the beams and joists that had been carrying my weight every morning for 23 years. Whatever was down there was not simply behind a wall. It had been beneath this table, beneath this chair, beneath every cup of coffee I had drunk in this kitchen, since Nolan moved his suitcases in and told me I needed to rest. I moved without deciding to move. Coat from the hook, flashlight from the drawer, bare feet because shoes take time, and time was the one thing I did not have. The stairs to the basement are 14 steps. I know this because I counted them going down in the dark, pressing each foot to the outer edge of each tread where the wood does not flex, keeping my weight distributed the way you keep weight distributed when you need to be absolutely silent past a closed door at 3 in the morning. Nolan's bedroom door was shut, no light beneath it. I passed it and did not breathe. I have spent my life working with probability. The chance that a section of a 137-year-old fieldstone wall would show newer mortar, less accumulated dust and stone, laid at a fractionally different angle by coincidence, by old settlement. By a repair no one thought to mention in 23 years of owning this house, I could calculate that probability precisely. I did not need to. The flashlight found it immediately a rectangle of fieldstone, roughly 6 feet by 4, where the mortar was the gray of something installed in the last decade rather than the cream yellow of the original construction. Less dust on the face of it, the shadow of the joints sitting differently. Not a natural variation. A decision someone made about this wall and did not tell me about. I turned off the flashlight. In the absolute dark, I pressed both palms flat against the newer section and held still. I was looking for vibration. What I found instead was warmth faint, barely there, the kind of warmth that means something on the other side is generating heat. And then when I pressed my ear to the stone and stopped breathing entirely, I heard it. Slow, shallow, patient, the unmistakable rhythm of a person breathing in a small space who has learned to breathe quietly. I knocked 3 times on the wall of my own basement at 3 in the morning. Let me say that plainly because I think the plainness of it matters. A 71-year-old man, barefoot in his coat, standing in the dark, pressing his knuckles against fieldstone because a plumber told him to, and his dead wife said to trust that plumber. 3 knocks, deliberate, evenly spaced, the same rhythm Arlo had described hearing 2 years ago. Then the wall knocked back, 3 knocks harder than mine, more urgent. The knocks of someone who had heard my 3 and understood immediately what they meant, that on this side of the stone there was finally a person who knew to listen. I felt each one in my sternum. I stood with my hands still on the wall, and I tried to find a word for what that felt like, and I could not. It was not relief, because I did not know yet who was there, or how long they had been there, or whether I could get them out before something worse happened. It was something older than relief. The recognition, cellular and absolute, that something alive had been waiting in the dark for someone to hear it, and after however long I did not yet know I had. Above my head a floorboard moved, 1 footstep, then another. Then a third crossing the ceiling in the direction of the kitchen, slow, slightly uneven, the specific rhythm of a person who is woken without an alarm and is orienting themselves to darkness. Vanessa. I knew her walk, the way you know any sound that has been present in your house for 14 months. I pressed both palms once more against the wall. A flat, deliberate pressure, not a knock, but a contact. A signal that meant something I hoped could be felt through stone. I know you were there. I will come back. I closed my fingers around the flashlight still off and moved to the stairs. 14 steps up, outer edges, no sound. I eased the basement door closed behind me with both hands on the knob until the latch caught without a click. Through the ceiling, Vanessa's footsteps slowed and stopped somewhere near the kitchen. I stood in the hallway in the dark, 6 feet from my son's bedroom door, my coat still on my heart, doing something I had no technical vocabulary for, and I waited. Her footsteps did not resume. After a long moment, I heard the soft sound of a chair being pulled out, and then the particular silence of someone sitting down in a dark kitchen for reasons of their own. I did not move. I stood motionless in that hallway and understood one thing with the complete clean certainty of a man whose professional life had been built on certainty someone was alive in my basement. Someone who had been there long enough to know that 3 knocks at 3 in the morning was the signal worth surviving for. When you cannot move and cannot sleep and cannot speak, your mind goes where it has been avoiding. Mine went to Maggie. It always went to Maggie. But this time, it went differently. Not to her face or her voice or the laugh she reserved for things that were genuinely funny, which was a different laugh entirely from the polite one she kept for other people's jokes. This time, it went to the specific moment I told her she was imagining things, and the exact expression she wore when I said it. She had raised it plainly the way she raised most things she meant seriously. We were at the kitchen table in early spring, the windows still sealed against the cold, and she looked at me with the direct steadiness I had spent 43 years learning to recognize as honesty and said, "Edmund, the way he looks at my pills. Have you noticed the way he looks at my pills? I need you to understand what kind of husband I was in that moment. Not a bad one, I want to be precise about this. I was an attentive husband, a present one, a man who believed his wife when she said she was happy and asked what was wrong when she was not. But I was also a man who, when the woman he loved told him something was frightening her, chose the explanation that cost him the least. I told her our son was being attentive. I told her he was worried about her, the way we both were, and she looked at me with an expression I could not name at the time and said nothing more that evening. I know that expression now. It was resignation. The second time, she was more direct. It was August, 3 months before she died, and she reached across the bed in the dark and gripped my arm with a strength that surprised me. The way the grip of a frightened person is always stronger than you expect. She said the pills, Edmund, please. Just count them yourself. Once. Tell me if the count is right. I told her I trusted our son to manage it. I told her he had been so careful about everything that I didn't want to undermine what he was doing for us. I told her to rest. I never counted the bottle. From that night forward, he held the medication routine without my involvement. And I had handed it to him myself, with both hands, and a reassuring smile, and the absolute conviction that what Maggie was experiencing was grief and exhaustion rather than what she already knew it to be. The last obstacle between my son and whatever he intended had been my refusal to count 12 pills on a Tuesday night in August. I had removed that obstacle myself. I had been thorough and precise about it. He called me 2 weeks before the hiking trip. Daniel called from his apartment in Cambridge on a Sunday evening, his voice careful, in the way voices go, careful when they are trying not to alarm. He told me something was wrong with the account statements, transfers he didn't recognize, signatures on documents that didn't look right to him. He asked me to look at them before the trip. Before he came up to Salem, said he wanted to go over everything in person. I told him our son handles all of that now. I told him not to worry. I told him our son had been very careful with everything. What did Daniel hear in my voice when I said that? What did he understand about his father in that moment that his father could not understand about himself? He came to Salem anyway, not for a brotherly reconciliation hike in October snow, the way it was presented afterward. He came because the phone call had not moved me, and he was running out of ways through. Our older son knew Daniel was coming. He had been in the kitchen that evening when the call came in on speaker, and I had not thought to close the door. The hiking trip was not a reaction to Daniel's arrival. It was a date already fixed, move forward to meet a deadline. I stood at Charter Street Cemetery in October and leaned on my older son, who wept at his brother's empty grave with a conviction I had no framework to examine. I put my arm around his shoulders. I felt the weight of what I took to be his grief against my side. He said he was my brother, his voice breaking in the way a voice breaks when the loss is total and without remedy. I believed him. While Daniel breathed in the dark beneath the floorboards of this house, I held on to his jailer and called it grief. I held on, and I wept, and I called it love. The ceiling above me was silent now. Vanessa had stopped moving in the kitchen. I lay in the dark bedroom and stared at the place where the ceiling met the wall and understood that the feeling I was trying to name was not grief and not rage, but something more foundational than either the recognition that I had been the most useful instrument in my own undoing and that I had been useful willingly, and that no one had needed to force me into it at any point along the way. I had done it all myself, with the best intentions a man can have, which are apparently no protection against anything. I thought of the 3 knocks. I thought of whoever was below the floor counting on me to hear them. I thought of Arlo driving back down Chestnut Street in the dark with a 14-month promise finally delivered. Then I stopped thinking and started planning, because planning was the only thing I had left that I knew how to do well. Every evening for 4 months, my son brought my wife her medication. He would stand in the bedroom doorway with a glass of water, and the pills in his palm held out flat. The way you offer something to an animal, you want to trust you, and he would wait while she swallowed them. He would take the glass back to the kitchen. He would tell her to sleep well. I thought it was the most loving thing I had ever watched a child do for a parent. I have not been able to think about it since without my hands doing something involuntary. The memory that came to me in the pre-dawn quiet was not the one I expected. It was not Maggie's face or her voice or the stillness of the January morning I reached for her hand and found it cold. It was my son's posture in the doorway. The practiced patience of a man who had learned to perform care so completely that the performance had become indistinguishable from the thing itself. He picked up her prescription every month, said the pharmacy was on his way, said it saved me the trip. How many times did I thank him for that? How many times did I stand in the kitchen and think, what a good son? How hard this has been on him, too. The pills traveled from the pharmacy counter to his hands to the bottle on Maggie's nightstand, and I never once touched them in between. Not once did I open the bottle and count what was inside. Not once did I hold one up to the light and ask, is this the right dosage? Is this what the doctor prescribed? I trusted the man who brought them. I trusted him with the blind completeness of a father who raised his son to be trustworthy and then used his own work against himself. The January morning arrived in memory, with the same quality it had arrived in life, without announcement, without the weight that grief is supposed to carry in the moment before it lands. I woke at 5:40 and reached for Maggie in the dark the way I had reached for her for 43 years, and my hand found the shape of her shoulder, and the shape was wrong, too still, too cool. The warmth a living person carries even in sleep was simply absent. My son called the emergency services. He stood beside me the entire time. He managed the paramedics with a composed efficiency that I read in that moment as strength, the strength of a man holding himself together for his father's sake. The medical examiner concluded accidental overdose of prescribed sleep medication. My son told me it had been his greatest fear that she might take too many by mistake in the night that he had been watching for signs. I held on to that sentence for weeks afterward. I carried it as the shape of his love for his mother. I did not hear inside it the sound of a prepared explanation. Isolation of this kind does not announce itself with locked doors or cut telephone lines. It arrives dressed as consideration, as people giving you space because you are grieving as your son, managing your affairs because you are too submerged to manage them yourself. It is assembled from materials that look exactly like love. That is precisely how it holds. Vanessa moved through my household with the warm efficiency of a woman who had made herself simultaneously indispensable and invisible, answering the front door with a body turned just slightly to fill the frame and a voice that was apologetic and kind. She told every departing neighbor I was resting, that I needed quiet, that she would pass along, that they had come by. Every word was true. I did need quiet. I was exhausted, and I was grieving. The explanation was a fact which made it impossible to argue with and impossible to see through. She gave each person a reason to feel considerate rather than dismissed, and they left satisfied and did not come back. 41 contacts to 11 in 6 months. I thought about the notebook on the kitchen table, the spiral-bound grocery list pad I had filled with 23 names the previous evening. I understood now what I had not understood. Then the people who called most frequently had been removed first, because they were the ones most likely to notice a change in my voice. The neighbor who came by unannounced went early because unannounced visits could not be managed at the door. My sister, who had known me for 69 years and would have heard the thing beneath the thing the moment I spoke, stopped calling in October. None of them drifted. Each absence was a managed decision, and Vanessa had been making those decisions one by one while I watched my son and called it gratitude. I had been watching the wrong person the entire time. The notebook sat face down on the table in front of me. The kitchen window showed the first gray suggestion of morning without committing to it. I sat with my hands flat on the table and pressed them down, not to stop them shaking, but to remind them what they were for. And I arranged my face into the expression of a man who had slept a reasonable number of hours and had nothing particular on his mind. Then my son's alarm went off through the ceiling. I heard the muffled click of it, then the silence of a man lying still for a moment before deciding to rise. I kept my hands flat on the table. I kept my face where I had put it. I thought of the 3 knocks still waiting in the dark below me, and I thought of Arlo's 5 words. And I held on to both of them the way you hold on to the only 2 fixed points in a room that has stopped being what you thought it was. I was ready when I heard his footsteps on the stairs. She set the pills beside my orange juice at 7:43, same as every morning, with the same quarter turn of her wrist and the same warm lift at the corner of her mouth. I had counted on that smile for 6 months. That morning, for the first time, I watched it the way I used to watch numbers, looking for what they were hiding. Blood pressure and the B12, Vanessa said, settling into the chair across from me with her own coffee. Don't forget the B12. Your levels were low last month. Thank you, Vanessa, I said. I don't know what I'd do. I meant it once, not that morning. I lifted the glass and drank. The pill went between my first 2 fingers and stayed there pressed flat against my palm, while the water went down, while I set the glass back on the table. While I said something about the weather that I do not now remember. She told me Nolan was driving them to Boston, a meeting she said back by 6. I nodded. I asked if she wanted more coffee. She said no. She rinsed her cup with the brisk efficiency that had become the rhythm of my mornings and was gone from the kitchen by 8. Let me tell you what I did with the pill. I sat at the kitchen table until I heard the front door, then the car, then the sound of the car fading down Chestnut Street. Then I went to the bathroom and opened the medicine cabinet. I was not looking for the pill to confirm I had taken it correctly. I was looking for the bottle it came from. I had been taking my medication from Vanessa's hand every morning for 6 months, without once opening the cabinet myself. The correct prescription was there, the labeled bottle, my name on it, the dosage printed clearly. Behind it, pushed to the back, where the cabinet shadow was deepest, was a second bottle. Amber plastic. No label. I shook it once. The pills inside were a different shape from the ones on Vanessa's printed label. I turned the unlabeled bottle toward the window light and read what I could read, which was the imprint code on the pill itself. And then I sat down on the edge of the tub, because my legs had made a decision my mind had not caught up with yet. I am a man who spent 40 years reading the difference between numbers that are wrong and numbers that are designed to look right. A beta blocker at 4 times the prescribed dosage is not a mistake. At 4 times the dosage taken daily for 6 months, it produces a specific constellation of effects: fatigue, cognitive slowing, episodes of dizziness on standing. A general fog that a 71-year-old widower in grief would attribute without hesitation to age and loss. I had attributed it to age and loss. I had told my doctor I was adjusting to grief, and he had told me that was normal, and I had gone home and taken the pills from Vanessa's hand and thanked her for being so careful. I did the calculation in the time it took to stand back up from the tub. I had not been getting old. I had been being managed. I have worked with forged documents before, not often, but enough to know what they look like when someone careful has made them. The asset transfer files in Nolan's cabinet were careful. My signature was nearly perfect. The pressure variation, the leftward lean that came into my handwriting in my late 50s. The particular way I extend the H in Harlow. Nearly. The cross stroke on the first signature was 2 millimeters too short. On the third, it was correct, meaning whoever had practiced it had gotten better between signing documents 1 and 3. An actuary reads variance for a living. I read it in 12 seconds. The documents were forgeries on estate assets worth $4.8 million. And the email chain with the Boston law firm showed a 30-day transfer timeline with a deadline I counted forward to 19 days from today. I moved to the laptop. I found the recovery folder in the phone backup application, navigated to deleted messages, and let it load. The first text was from 3 weeks before the hiking trip. The second was from 2 weeks before, both from Daniel's number, both showing delivered status, both showing read receipts on a date when I had not touched my phone. Dad, I've been trying to reach you. Can we talk before the trip? I need to show you something. Dad, something's wrong with the numbers. Transfers I don't recognize. Please call me. It's important. He had tried to warn me twice. Someone had made sure I never saw either message. And then below the texts, the call log. There were 3 calls from my phone to Daniel's number in the 2 weeks before the hiking trip. 3 calls I did not make. Someone had picked up my phone in an afternoon when I was resting, when Nolan was present in the house, and dialed my son, and spoken in whatever voice was required to keep him calm and on schedule. Daniel heard his father's number appear on his screen. He heard a voice that answered his concern with something sufficient, and then he got into a car with his brother 2 weeks later and drove north toward the White Mountains reassured. I put the phone down and sat very still in Nolan's chair in Nolan's office, surrounded by Nolan's careful paperwork. 2 deleted texts, 3 calls I never made, 1 bottle with no label, and a transfer timeline expiring in 19 days. A car turned onto Chestnut Street. I heard it slow as it passed the house, and my body was already moving the phone back in its charging position, the laptop back at the angle I had found it. The filing drawer eased shut because Nolan had said Boston, but he had not said how long. I put everything back. Every document at its original angle, every drawer pushed to the same resistance point. The phone screen cleared, the chair returned to where I had found it. Then I walked to the kitchen and stood at the window with both hands on the counter, letting my pulse do what it needed to do, and saw that Vanessa was already in the backyard, already on her phone, and already someone I had never met before. Her posture was the first thing. The woman who managed my household moved through it with a particular softness, rounded shoulders, a slight forward lean toward whatever she was carrying, the physical grammar of a caretaker. The woman standing in the snow had no softness in her at all. Her shoulders were square, her chin level, her weight distributed evenly on both feet, the way a person stands when they are at work and not performing care. She was not facing the house. She had gone to the far end of the yard, where the hedgerow blocked the neighbor's sightline, and she was speaking in a voice too low to carry through glass. I opened the window 1 inch. The cold came in immediately, and with it, her voice stripped of everything I recognized. Flat and efficient and businesslike in the way that people are businesslike when they are not being observed by anyone whose opinion they require. She mentioned a property in Marblehead, 3 bedrooms, water view, said she had already looked at it twice. 2 more months tops. That was what she said next. He takes whatever we give him every morning like a good boy. 2 more months. I want you to hold that number for a moment. Not eventually, not when the time is right. 2 months, a number, a deadline. A woman standing in the snow in my own backyard, describing the life she intended to purchase with whatever remained of me after 60 more days of pills from her hand. She had a property already picked. She had a water view already chosen. She had a timeline already counted. I closed the window and stood at the kitchen counter and did not move for a long time. Before I show you what I found next, if you are still with me in this story, comment 1 word for what you felt when you heard that number. 2 months. I want to know how it landed. A note the scene that follows contains recreated details to convey what this discovery felt like from the inside. What I hope stays with you is not the detail, but the weight of it. I went to the garage in the afternoon on the pretense of finding a hammer. It was a real pretense. I did need the hammer, and I needed the flashlight, and I needed a reason to be in there that would hold up under a casual question. The garage was cold and dim and smelled the way garages in December smell: motor oil, old concrete, the faint plastic tang of things stored in bags for longer than intended. I have examined a great many documents in my career that were designed to obscure the truth. Mortality tables built on skewed assumptions, projections that concealed variance in their rounding. I always looked for the one detail that was too clean, the number too round the line too straight, the outcome that assumed away the outliers. A rope cut by weather and friction is never clean. Friction produces fraying uneven, graduated the fibers, giving way at different rates under different loads. What I found behind the water heater, inside a black plastic bag that had no business being in my garage and was placed there with the deliberate concealment of something never intended to be found, was not frayed. The end of Daniel's climbing rope was cut with a single blade stroke so clean and straight and precise that the compressed fibers at the edge still held their original twist. One stroke, something sharp, someone still. I recognized the rope itself. This was Daniel's equipment from the White Mountain trip, the gear that had traveled north with him in October, that should have failed at altitude in a blizzard. In a place where failure leaves nothing to examine, it had not failed. Daniel had not been lost in a storm. He had been sent into it. The distinction between those 2 sentences is the distance between a tragedy and a crime, and I had spent 14 months on the wrong side of it. I turned the rope over in my hands and found still attached to the nylon loop at the undamaged end the manufacturer's tag. The tag had a sticker on the back, small adhesive, the kind that outdoor supply stores use for inventory, a purchase date, and a store code. I knew the store. It was on Darby Street, 8 minutes from this house. The purchase date was 3 months before the hiking trip. Nolan had bought this rope. He had bought it as a gift. I remembered now the specific evening Daniel arrived with the new gear in a paper bag and said Nolan had wanted to contribute to the trip, had wanted to do something brotherly, had seemed genuinely happy about it. Daniel had thanked him. I had thanked him. I had thought what a good thing that they were finding their way back to each other. The murder weapon had been purchased as a gift. The preparation for my son's death had been performed as an act of generosity. Wrapped in a paper bag and handed over with a smile I would never be able to recall now without my hands doing what they were doing on the garage floor. I sat on the cold concrete with the rope across my knees and understood that I had stopped gathering evidence some time ago. I was sitting inside a crime scene that had been hiding in my house for 14 months. I needed to make one phone call, and I needed to make it before Nolan came home. I made my decision on a cold concrete floor with a cut rope in my lap. Not the rope that made me decide the decision had been accumulating for 3 days, building the way ice builds quietly in layers until it holds the weight of everything placed on top of it. What the rope gave me was not the will, it gave me the calendar. 4 days. I needed 4 days to do this without alerting the man sleeping in my guest room, and I needed to make one call before he came home from Boston. I dialed Arlo's number with the water heater running beside me and my back against the garage wall. He answered on the first ring. I spoke in a voice barely above a whisper and told him what I had found. The documents, the deleted texts, the 3 calls I never made the unlabeled bottle, and the rope across my knees with the purchase date tag still attached from a Darby Street store 3 months before Daniel's hiking trip. I told him about the knocks at 3 in the morning and what answered back. I asked for 4 days. I told him when I sent the word pipe he should come, and he should bring whoever needed to come. Arlo was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I already called her 2 days ago. The morning I left your driveway." Her name was Detective Lorna Garrett, a Salem PD investigator, whom Arlo had contacted the morning after leaving Chestnut Street, had given her enough to open a preliminary inquiry, but not enough to move without confirmation from inside the house. I had been alone for 3 days, and had not been alone for a single hour of it. The investigation had been open since before I found the rope. The power in this situation had been shifting longer than I understood, and in a direction I had not calculated. I want to tell you what those 4 days were like, because I think the people who have never had to perform love for someone who was taking everything from them deserve to understand what it actually costs. It is not dramatic. There is no moment where your face nearly breaks and they almost see through you. It is smaller than that, and worse than that. It is passing the salt. It is asking if they want more coffee. It is laughing at precisely the right moment during the evening news, and then lying in the dark 2 hours later, listening to them breathe through the wall. It is thanking the woman who gives you your pills every morning with a warmth that costs you something each time, and giving her nothing back that she can use. Every morning, the pill went into my palm and then into the bathroom drain while I ran the tap. Every evening I sat at the table and ate whatever Vanessa had made and said it was good, because it was always good, and she always made sure it was good, because that was part of what she was performing as well. 2 people performing warmth at each other across a kitchen table. One of us knew it. I have thought since about whether she knew it too. I believe she did. I believe she sat across from me every evening and found it easy, and that the easiness of it was its own kind of information about what kind of person she was. Every night at 3 in the morning, I went to the basement and knocked 3 times and received 3 knocks back. I thought of those knocks the way an actuary thinks of a confirmed data point in an uncertain model, not reassuring exactly, but stabilizing. Orientation in a situation with too many unknowns. Someone was behind that wall, and they were still counting. Every 3 knocks back told me still running, still here, still worth the 4 days I was asking for. I moved back up the stairs each time with something that was not quite hope, but was close enough to serve the same function. On the 3rd night, the knocks changed. 4 knocks, not 3-4, delivered in the same deliberate rhythm, but with an extra beat that I felt in my sternum before I heard it. I knocked 3 back. 4 came again, then 3 from me, then 4, then 3, then 4. We knocked at each other through a foot of field stone at 3 in the morning, trading a message neither of us had the vocabulary for yet. I stood in the dark with my hand flat on the wall, and understood only that whoever was behind it was trying to tell me something had shifted urgency or deterioration, or simply the unbearable pressure of running out of time, and that I had 1 night left in my 4-day window, and it was now moving faster than I had calculated. On the 4th morning, Nolan came down the stairs at 8 and sat at the kitchen table and told me he and Vanessa were going to Boston. Shopping, he said. Some things Vanessa wanted to look at. Back by 6. Shopping. I looked at the man who had killed my wife and imprisoned my son and planned to manage my death in 60-day increments, and I said, "Of course, take your time." I held my coffee with both hands to keep them still. Vanessa smiled at me from the counter where she was rinsing her cup, the practice smile, unchanged across 4 days, and I smiled back with the specific warmth I had been spending carefully all week, making sure not to change the denomination. Nolan picked up his keys. Vanessa followed him to the door. I sat at the table and listened to the car start, listened to it, reverse, listened to it, move down Chestnut Street and grow quiet and quieter, and then stop entirely. The moment I could no longer hear the engine, I was already moving. I had staged the hammer and flashlight on the kitchen counter 2 days before. I had measured the walk from the kitchen to the basement stairs and back 17 times in my head. The The moment Nolan's car turned off Chestnut Street, I did not hesitate, did not think, did not feel. I simply moved because I had already done everything else. The hammer went into my right hand. The flashlight went under my left arm. I was at the basement door in 11 seconds. The far wall looked the same, under the flashlight, as it had on every other night I had come down here. Fieldstone, old mortar, the newer section I had already identified in Task 2. 2 sitting in the beam, with its slightly different coloring and slightly less dust. But I was not looking for what I already knew. I was looking for the frame. I moved the beam along the edges of the newer section, slowly, the way you read a document you have already read, looking for what you missed the first time. I found it at the upper left corner, a paint seam raised by a fraction of a millimeter. The kind of raised seam you get when paint is applied over a gap rather than a flush surface. I ran my finger along it, and it held the way a door frame holds, not the way stone holds. I moved the beam to the right edge and found the same seam, then the bottom, then back to the left. A rectangle roughly 6 feet high and 3 wide. A door, concealed not by craftsmanship, but by patience and paint, and the assumption that no one would ever look. The noise was the problem I had not fully solved. A hammer against a lock mechanism in a fieldstone basement at 10 in the morning, I had no way to know how far it carried through the walls of an 1887 house on a quiet December street. I made a decision, 11 minutes maximum. If the lock did not give in 11 minutes, I would stop, replace what I could, and find another approach. I gave myself 11 minutes, and I hit the lock with everything I had, because I had already paid the price of hesitation, and I was not paying it again. I worked the pry tool along the seam near the latch point, and drove the hammer against it in controlled, deliberate strokes. Not the frantic hammering of panic, but the measured percussion of a man who has done the calculation and knows exactly how much force the problem requires. Each strike bounced off the fieldstone walls and came back to me. I counted them under my breath. The house above me was empty and silent. I told myself this each time the noise seemed too large. Let me tell you what I was thinking while I worked. Not strategy I had done the strategy. Not fear I had made my peace with the fear 4 days ago on a garage floor with a cut rope across my knees. What I was thinking about was Maggie. Specifically, I was thinking about the last time she asked me to be careful, not the dramatic final version, but the quieter one. 3 months earlier, standing at the kitchen sink. Not even looking at me saying it, the way you say something you have said so many times, it has become reflex. Be careful, Edmund. And me saying, of course, already thinking about something else. This hammer, this lock, this cold, this deliberate noise in my own basement. This was what careful looked like when it arrived 14 months too late and had to work twice as hard to mean anything. The lock began to give at the 9-minute mark. I felt it before I heard it. A slight give in the resistance, the pry tool, finding a millimeter of purchase it had not found before. I switched from percussion to sustained lever pressure, both hands on the tool, my weight behind it, and worked the gap open by increments so small I could not see them, but could feel them in my palms. At 11 minutes and 40 seconds over my limit, a variance I had already accepted, the latch mechanism released. I stepped back and raised the flashlight to the interior edge of the door frame, examining the side that had been facing inward, the side that would have been visible from inside the room. And I stopped for a count of 3. The marks were scratched into the paint with something small, a coin I thought, or a fingernail worn to the point of hardness. Tally marks. Groups of 5, the universal system, the one you use when you need the count to be exact and you cannot afford to lose your place. I moved the flashlight beam slowly down the frame, counting the groups. I counted twice because the first count did not seem possible. 512 days. 512 was not 17 months. 512 was closer to 17 months than it was to 24, but it was not 17 months. Someone had been marking days on this door frame beginning before Daniel ever got into a car with his brother and drove north to the White Mountains. Either Daniel had been here longer than any missing person's timeline had accounted for, or someone else had lived in this room before him. I did not know which. I knew only that 512 marks represented 512 mornings, when a person woke in a sealed room and made a deliberate choice to keep counting. My hand rested on the door handle. The lock was open. The tally marks were on the frame behind me. I took one breath, not for courage, I was past courage, but for precision. The way you take a breath before a calculation you need to get right. I thought of nothing at all. Then I pulled the door open, and the darkness and the stale air came out together, and I raised my flashlight into the room. The smell arrived before my eyes could make sense of what I was seeing, sealed air-old stone, something underneath it that I recognized as human and did not want to name. I held the flashlight steady. I have held a great many things steady in my life. I want you to understand what that cost in that doorway in that moment. The room was 10 feet by 10 feet, a narrow cot against the far wall, a water jug on the floor beside it mostly empty, a waste bucket in the corner, and on the cot not moving a figure that my flashlight beam found, and my mind refused for 2 full seconds to process. He did not look like Daniel. I want to say that plainly, because the plainness of it matters. The man on that cot did not look like my son. He looked like what happens when you take a person and remove light and adequate food and human contact for 17 months, and replace those things with a cot and a water jug and 3 knocks at 3 in the morning, the hair past his shoulders, the skin a gray pale that has no word in the vocabulary of healthy people. Clothes hanging 3 sizes too large on a frame that I could see the shape of through the fabric, not the shape of a man, but the shape of what remains when a man has been reduced to his minimum. I knew it was Daniel because he knew it was me. That was the only way either of us could be certain. I crossed the room and knelt beside the cot. I said his name. One word, barely a whisper, my voice doing something involuntary that I did not try to correct. Daniel. His eyes opened. Slowly, the slow opening of eyes that have spent 17 months in a space with no natural light and have lost the habit of adjusting quickly. They were clouded at first, then sharpening, then finding my face with a sudden desperate focus that I felt in my sternum like a struck chord. Dad. 2 syllables cracked down the middle, barely sound. And then after a long moment of searching my face with an intensity I will carry for the rest of my life, "You're real." "I'm real," I said. "I'm here." My hand found his arm, and the shock of it, how close the bone was to the surface. How little was there ran through me like cold water, and I held on because letting go was not something I was willing to do. "I'm sorry it took me this long. I am so sorry." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is she okay? Is Mum okay?" I had known this question was coming, and I had not found a way to prepare for it. There is no preparation for telling your son in a sealed room in your own basement that his mother died 11 months ago while he was 12 feet below the kitchen where she used to make Sunday breakfast. I told him in the fewest words that were still honest. I watched his face receive it. I held his arm through the receiving of it and did not look away, because that was the only thing I could still give him at that moment, the refusal to look away. He said he heard my footsteps every day. Above him, moving through the house, to the kitchen, to the study down the hall and back. He said he knew my gait the way you know music you grew up with. You do not hear it consciously. You recognize it, and then it is inside you before you have decided to let it in. For 17 months, while I performed normalcy at the breakfast table and palmed my pills and smiled at the right moments, my son was 12 feet below me, mapping my life by sound, waiting for me to hear him back. The 3-knock signal started in month 2, he said. He had worked out that the water pipes ran close to the wall where he heard the most footstep traffic, and that someone standing at a particular point in the basement would be in proximity to his knocking. He had knocked every night at 3 in the morning, because 3 in the morning was the hour when the footsteps above him had stopped for the day. He had knocked for 15 months before the night I finally answered. A car. Above us, tires on the driveway, gravel, the specific sound of a vehicle turning in rather than passing. Not a passing sound, a stopping sound. I looked at my son, who weighed perhaps 130 pounds, and had spent 2 months trying to build enough strength in his legs to stand. And I made a calculation that required no time at all. We could not be found in this room. Whatever came next had to happen upstairs in the light, where Daniel could be seen by someone whose job it was to see him. "Someone's here," I said. "Can you stand?" Daniel looked at me with an expression I recognized from 40 years earlier, the specific look of a Harlow man who has been asked if he can do something difficult and is deciding whether the truth is useful. "I've been working on it," he said. "Ask me again when I'm trying." I put my arm around his back. He put his weight on me. We stood. Then Arlo's voice from the top of the basement stairs, quiet, steady, carrying the particular certainty of a man who has been carrying a promise for a long time and has finally arrived at the moment to keep it. "Edmund, I've got someone with me. It's time." I looked at Daniel. He looked at me. We had been 12 feet apart for 17 months. We took the first step toward the stairs together. The first thing Daniel did when he reached the top of the stairs was stop. Not from weakness. He had made every step under his own weight, one hand on the rail, one on my arm, his jaw set in the specific way of a man who has decided that the difficulty of a thing is not a reason to stop doing it. He stopped because there was light. Ordinary hallway, light the kind that had been burning in this house every morning of his life. He stood in it for 3 seconds and did not speak, and I did not rush him. Detective Lorna Garrett, 46, stood at the far end of the hallway, with her badge already out and her eyes moving across the space with the practiced assessment of someone who has learned never to assume a scene is what it appears to be, and who had arrived at 1887 Chestnut Street before Edmund dialed a single digit, responding to Arlo's noon protocol with 2 officers and a position already established. Officer Celia Moran, standing to Garrett's left, with her hand on her radio, took in Daniel's condition in 1 second and was already on the radio. In the next, her voice calm and specific, calling for a medical unit. Officer Grant Holloway Garrett had told Arlo was already at the back of the property. We were 4 people in a hallway when the front door opened. Nolan opened it the way he had opened it every day for 14 months, his key, his rhythm. The specific sound of a man who considers a place entirely his own. He stepped inside. He saw his father. He saw the officers. He saw his brother upright in the hallway light, and I watched his face move through 4 things in approximately 2 seconds. Surprise, recognition, calculation, and the decision still wrong. Even now at the end of everything to lunge. He chose violence in the hallway of the house, where he was raised in front of the brother he had kept below its floor for 17 months. And Officer Moran had her handcuffs out before he crossed half the distance. The takedown was swift and practiced and entirely without drama. 11 seconds door to floor. I counted. It is what I do. Vanessa came in behind him. When she understood what she was seeing, she turned and ran for the back of the house through the kitchen for the garden door. And Officer Holloway, who had been briefed on the layout and had taken his position 20 minutes before the front door opened, was at the fence before she reached it. An arrest, when it happens correctly, is one of the least dramatic things I have ever witnessed. It is paperwork made physical, a series of practiced procedural steps executed by people who have done them many times. No elevated voices, no negotiation, no moment where the outcome is genuinely uncertain. Garrett read the charges in a flat professional voice. Moran managed the handcuffs. Holloway walked Vanessa back through the garden door, with one hand at her elbow, his tone the same tone you would use to guide someone through a crowded room. The whole sequence had the quality of a process that had been waiting a long time for the conditions to be met, and now that they had been met, it proceeded with quiet, unstoppable efficiency. They loaded Nolan into the first cruiser. Before the door closed, he turned to look at me through the window. And for the first and only time in this story, Nolan said something without calculating the effect first. "You were supposed to be dead by now, old man. I want to tell you that I felt something clean when I heard that rage or satisfaction, or the specific vindication of a man who has been dismissed for too long. But what I felt was the cold December air on my face and the specific understanding that this sentence spoken through a police cruiser window was the most honest thing my son had ever said to me." I looked at him. "I know," I said, "but I'm not, and neither is your brother." The door closed. I stood on the porch steps and watched both cruisers reverse down the driveway and clear the end of Chestnut Street. Then I watched the street after they were gone, because there was nothing else to do with my eyes, and I was not yet ready to go back inside. I want to tell you that I felt something clean when I heard that door close, something finished and righteous and complete, but that is not what I felt. I felt cold. The house behind me with a broken basement wall and 17 months of damage inside it, and the understanding that the arrest was the beginning of the accounting, not the end of it. Justice, I was learning, is not a feeling. It is a process, and this one had barely started. Vanessa's cruiser was the second to leave. As the door closed, she looked not at Nolan in the first car, not at the officers, but at me. Her expression in that moment was not fear and not defiance. It was something I had not expected and did not know what to do with relief. The specific expression of a person who has been waiting for someone to stop something they did not know how to stop themselves. I filed it under things I do not yet understand and watched the car go. Detective Garrett came to stand beside me on the porch steps when both cars had cleared the street. She was quiet for a moment in the December air. Then she opened her notebook. "We found a folder on his laptop," she said. "I need you to come inside and sit down before I show you what's in it." I looked at her face. A man who has spent 40 years reading Risk knows what a face looks like when the information behind it is about someone who is already gone. "It's about Maggie," I said. She did not deny it. The ambulance moved without sirens. I noticed that before anything else, someone had made a quiet decision that urgency and calm could coexist, and I was grateful for it in a way I could not have explained to anyone who asked. Daniel was on the narrow cot across from me, a paramedic named Torres working steadily between us, and I kept my hands on my knees because that was the most I could offer without coming apart. He was awake. His eyes tracked the ceiling panels with the focused steadiness of a man who has learned to anchor himself to fixed close surfaces. Low ceilings, near walls. The immediate and bounded, rather than the wide and open. I had not understood this yet. I would understand it later in the hospital corridor when the bay doors opened and the February sky appeared above us, and Daniel pulled a breath that was not quite a breath. But in the ambulance, I only saw a man keeping his eyes on the ceiling and counting something I could not hear. Torres moved to the supply case. Daniel turned his head toward the window, toward the passing buildings, not toward me, and asked his question quietly as though addressing it to the glass rather than to his father. "Is she gone?" I told him yes. I did not decorate it or soften the edges or offer anything around it because there was nothing around it worth offering. He nodded once, a single slow movement that closed something in his face, and looked back at the ceiling and resumed whatever count he had been keeping. I understood. There are griefs that require privacy even from the people who share them. I gave him his. Dr. Phoebe Stanton met us at intake. She was composed and direct in the way of someone who has learned that composure is the first thing a patient in crisis needs from a stranger. She introduced herself to Daniel, not to me, which was the right instinct. She said, "Mr. Harlow, you are at Massachusetts General. You are safe here, and nothing happens to your body today without your consent." Daniel blinked at her slowly. It was, I think, the first time in 17 months that anyone had offered him a sentence built around his own authority over himself. They took him through a set of double doors I was not permitted to follow through. I stood in the corridor for a moment with the stillness of a man whose forward motion has just been removed. Torres handed me the admission paperwork on a clipboard. I signed where indicated. My handwriting was steady. I noted this the way I noted everything now, as evidence of a self still functioning within its tolerances. Detective Garrett found me in the family waiting room 20 minutes later. The room smelled of burnt coffee and the institutional disinfectant that hospitals use on fabric surfaces, a combination that sits somewhere between clean and anxious. She sat in the chair beside mine, without asking, which I had come to understand was her way not rude, but efficient with small permissions. She had a folder on her knee. She did not open it immediately. She asked how Daniel had seemed in the ambulance. I told her aware, controlled, economical with words. She wrote that down. She asked if he had said anything about the captivity period, and I told her about the one question he had asked, and nothing more. Because some things belong to a person before they belong to an investigation. And I said so without apology. She did not argue. She made a note and moved on. Then she opened the folder. I am a man who has spent 4 decades reading documents under conditions that required precision. I know what a pre-signed document looks like. The date applied before the event. It records the signature completed with a forward certainty that belongs to expectation rather than outcome. I saw both of those things in the first 3 seconds. What I was looking at was a death certificate for Daniel Harlow dated November 14th, 2023, signed by a physician whose name I did not recognize, notarized in Middlesex County. The cause of death listed was exposure consistent with a hiking accident. The certificate was complete in every technical detail, except one. Daniel was currently 40 feet away from me, breathing, waiting for a doctor who had promised him nothing would happen without his consent. I did not speak for a moment. Garrett let the silence sit, which was the right decision. When I did speak, I said only he had this before Daniel ever left for the mountains. Not a question. She confirmed it with a single nod. The document had been commissioned 2 months before the hiking trip, which meant the trip was never a plan that went wrong. It was the delivery mechanism for a conclusion already written and waiting. I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth and held it there. At 4:47, Dr. Stanton appeared at the waiting room entrance. She said Daniel was dehydrated, malnourished, with 2 healing rib fractures and significant vitamin deficiencies across the board, but stable and asking for me. She paused and then added the sentence I will carry for whatever years I have left. He told me to tell you that he kept count. He said you would know what that means. I knew. 512 marks on a door frame in the dark. He had been counting for both of us, keeping the record for a father who did not yet know there was a record to keep. Holding the number intact across 512 mornings in a sealed room, so that when the wall finally opened, there would be something exact and true to hand across. That was my son. That was what I had raised without knowing what I was raising it for. I stood up from the waiting room chair and walked to the corridor window and looked at the February sky for a long time without seeing it. Then I turned around because there was a folder still open on the chair beside mine and a detective still waiting, and the accounting was not finished yet. It had barely started. She had not moved the photograph, not even a centimeter. It remained exactly where it had been when I first noticed it angle slightly toward the window, catching a pale wash of winter light that made the glass look almost liquid. She sat beside me, not touching it, not acknowledging it as if its presence did not require explanation. Instead, she opened her notebook to a clean page, a deliberate gesture precise, and began where she always began, with what could be proven. Because Garrett did not deal in emotion first. She dealt in structure. I recognized that instinct immediately. It was the same instinct I had relied on for most of my adult life, the discipline of building conclusions only after the foundation had been tested. Evidence first, interpretation later. It was the only way to prevent collapse. We were sitting in the beige waiting room of Massachusetts General Hospital, a room designed to hold uncertainty without resolving it. The kind of room where people waited to be told things they were not prepared to hear. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and old upholstery, the kind that had absorbed too many conversations it could not forget. And in that room, she showed me the architecture of what my son had built. Not metaphorically, not emotionally, architecturally. Layer by layer, the forged signature software came first. Garrett described it without emphasis, without judgment, just the facts. It existed on a partition of Nolan's laptop that required a secondary password, not hidden exactly, not concealed in the way amateurs conceal things. It was separated, segregated, as if it belonged to a different version of him, one that operated under different rules. The program itself was not crude. It was not experimental. It was refined, capable of replicating handwriting patterns across scanned documents with a margin of error below 5%. My handwriting, 43 years of it, every contract I had signed, every letter, every margin note, every Christmas card, every check, every initial, reduced to data, modeled, reconstructed. She placed a printed sample beside one of my original signatures, and I could not tell them apart. Not at first, not even after a second look. It was only when she pointed quietly, almost apologetically, to the pressure differential in the downward stroke of the H that I saw it. A fraction of hesitation, a microscopic inconsistency, something no human eye would notice unless it had been trained to, which meant effectively there was no difference. Not one that mattered. The Mercer Group debt came next. $2.3 million borrowed in 2021. Private lending structure, shell entity. Registered in Delaware, a jurisdiction chosen not for convenience but for opacity. By October 2023, the total had grown to 2.9 million. Accrued interest, compounding pressure. Garrett did not need to explain what that meant. I understood numbers. I understood leverage. I understood deadlines. And there had been a deadline. In September, the same month Nolan invited Daniel on that hiking trip, Mercer Group issued a 30-day ultimatum. 30 days, not negotiable, not extendable. 30 days to resolve a debt that had already exceeded its intended boundaries. The connection formed in my chest before it reached my mind. It was not a realization. It was a recognition. He had needed Daniel dead before those 30 days expired. Not eventually, not hypothetically, specifically. Within a fixed window, the hiking trip had not been spontaneous. It had been scheduled, timed, aligned with a financial constraint that required a solution no bank would accept. Then Garrett placed the captivity log between us. She did not hand it to me. She set it down, as if it were something that required space. 510 entries, 17 months, daily documentation. Each entry dated, each written in Nolan's hand, clinical, consistent, uninterrupted. She turned to month 12. I did not want to look, but I did. Because at that point not looking was no longer an option. The entry read, physical condition declining at acceptable rate. I read it once, then again, then a third time, because the words themselves were simple, familiar, structurally harmless, and yet they did not belong where they were. Acceptable. The word echoed in a way that did not align with its context. Acceptable was a term used in reports, in forecasts, in projections, in risk assessments. It was not a word used to describe a human being's deterioration. It was not a word used in proximity to suffering, and yet there it was, written in his handwriting, on a page that had been created in my house, while I sat 12 feet above it, believing something entirely different about the world beneath my feet. Garrett closed the log, not abruptly, not gently, just conclusively. And then she moved to the next piece. Vanessa, arrested at Boston Logan Airport. Carry-on luggage only. One-way ticket to Chicago. Purchased 3 hours after Nolan's arrest. She had not gone home. Not even briefly. She had gone directly to the airport, which meant the bag had already been packed, prepared in advance, waiting. The speed of it mattered, because speed implied readiness, and readiness implied knowledge. I began to follow that line of thought. Then I stopped, because Garrett closed her notebook, and said, "There is one more thing, sir, about your wife." And the pause that followed lasted exactly long enough. Long enough for the absence of words to carry more weight than any explanation. Long enough for me to understand that everything I had processed so far, every document, every number, every entry, had not yet reached the center of it. I need to explain something. Because there is a difference between losing someone and being told you misunderstood how you lost them. For 13 months, I had been grieving an accident, a terrible one, a senseless one, but still an accident, something without intent, without authorship, without design. And that kind of grief, while heavy, has a certain structure to it. It has edges, boundaries. You can place it somewhere in your mind and say this is where it belongs. But when you are told that it was not an accident, those boundaries dissolve, because now the loss has a cause, and the cause has a name, and the name belongs to someone who lived inside your life, someone who moved through your house, someone who made you coffee, someone who stood beside you at the funeral. The tissue samples had been preserved. That detail mattered because it meant the past had not fully closed. A court-ordered review, initiated 2 days before Daniel was found, had already begun. Not because of me, because of Arlo. He had gone to Garrett immediately after leaving Chestnut Street. He had given his statement, everything Maggie had told him, everything he had held on to. Garrett had acted on that alone. Before I made a call, before the basement was opened, before the truth surfaced, Maggie's case had already been moving, quietly, without me. The results showed elevated digoxin levels, not a single spike, not an isolated event, accumulation, incremental, sustained over months, which meant It had been administered repeatedly, carefully, deliberately. The official classification was being changed from accidental to undetermined, pending exhumation, pending confirmation, pending the final step in a process that had already begun to reshape everything I thought I understood. I stood up. I do not remember deciding to stand. I only remember being in the corridor. The fluorescent light above me was too bright. Or perhaps it was exactly as bright as it had always been. I sat on the floor, back against the wall, and I did not think about the toxicology. Not immediately. I did not think about the classification or the exhumation. I thought about something smaller, something quieter, something I had dismissed. My wife, 2 weeks before she died, holding my hand, asking me to write something down. A sequence of numbers, specific, carefully spoken, and I had smiled. I had said, of course, and I had not written anything. Because I believed she was confused. Because the medication had been making her confused. Because that was the narrative I had accepted. The one that required the least resistance. She had not been confused. She had been precise. She had found something, and she had tried to give it to me, and I had not taken it. Not because I did not care, but because I trusted the structure of the world I thought I lived in. And that trust was the exact mechanism that allowed everything else to happen. Garrett crouched beside me. Her voice did not change. Not softer, not louder, just steady. There's one more piece, she said. Something Vanessa said. In processing, before she asked for a lawyer. Voluntary. Unprompted. Recorded. She read it from her notes. I closed my eyes. Because I had believed incorrectly that there was a limit to how much worse it could become. And I was about to learn that I had not yet reached it. What Vanessa said before she asked for a lawyer was this: she knew about the medication adjustment 2 weeks before Maggie died. She did not hesitate when she said it. There was no visible calculation in her expression, no pause long enough to suggest uncertainty. It came out cleanly, like a statement she had already rehearsed and accepted as the correct version of events to present first. She had not administered it herself, but she had known. That was the sentence she chose to lead with. Not a denial, not confusion, not shock, a calibration. I sat with that distinction longer than I expected to. Not the fact of what she knew that part had already begun to settle into place with a clarity that felt almost procedural, but the structure of how she admitted it. There is a legal architecture to statements like that. Layers, edges, boundaries carefully drawn, not to erase involvement, but to define it with precision. She placed herself exactly where she needed to be, close enough to the truth to appear cooperative, far enough from the act to avoid immediate collapse into full culpability. She had not simply known. She had known how to say that she knew. That was the part that stayed with me, because it meant that by the time the cuffs were on her wrists, she had already run the model, already assessed exposure, already selected the version of reality that would serve her best in the hours that followed. Most people panic first and calculate later. Vanessa had reversed that order. The panic, if it existed at all, had been managed somewhere before the officer ever spoke to her. Garrett moved me from the corridor to a briefing room the following morning. The transition itself felt abrupt, but necessary the way grief is often forced to share space with process, whether it is ready or not. The hotel Vanessa had arranged near Massachusetts General Hospital was indistinguishable from the hospital itself in everything except function. Clean, neutral, temporary. A place designed to hold people in transit between events they did not control. I slept 3 hours. Not deeply. Not enough. I arrived at the briefing room with a cup of coffee that had already cooled past usefulness. Garrett was already there. She had a diagram spread across the table pages, anchored with her hand to keep them from shifting. Numbers, arrows, dates. The September ultimatum, circled in blue ink, not emphasized dramatically, just marked in a way that suggested importance without needing to declare it. She walked me through it the way she always did. Foundation first, then structure, then implication. The Mercer Group debt began in 2021, $2.3 million, not through a bank, not through a standard instrument, through a private lending structure routed through a shell entity registered in Delaware, legal technically, designed to appear legitimate at the surface level while embedding conditions that would only fully reveal themselves once the borrower was already committed. The project it funded, a waterfront development in Providence, collapsed entirely in 2022. By October 2023, the debt had grown to $2.9 million. Not by accident, by design. Compounding interest schedules, penalty triggers, clauses nested within clauses that ensured the number would accelerate faster than any realistic repayment model could sustain. Garrett didn't need to explain that part. I understood it immediately. I had spent 4 decades reading documents exactly like that, identifying the points where risk ceased to be theoretical and became inevitable. In September 2023, the Mercer Group issued a 30-day ultimatum. Garrett tapped the circled date once. "That's your pivot point," she said. I understood. "I am going to tell you what it feels like to see your wife's death positioned inside a financial model. It does not feel like anger. Anger requires surprise. This felt like recognition. Like looking at a spreadsheet built by someone else and realizing with professional clarity exactly how they had constructed it. What variables they had included, what variables they had chosen to ignore, and most importantly, what they had decided was acceptable to sacrifice in order to reach the outcome. I had built models like that for 40 years. Policies, premiums, risk exposure. But in Nolan's model, the variables were people, and the outcome had been calculated long before the events themselves unfolded. The asset transfer plan found in Nolan's email chain confirmed it. It was not a draft. It was a progression. 11 revisions over 8 months. Each version refining the same objective, adjusting for obstacles, tightening execution. The final revision had been saved 4 days before he invited Daniel on the hiking trip. 4 days. He had finalized the plan. Then he had set it in motion. I had walked past that office 1,000 times. Never once considered that behind that door, my son had been drafting the conditions of our family's end. The Mercer Group called me on the 3rd day. I was in the hotel room when my phone lit up with an unfamiliar Providence area code. I answered without thinking. The voice on the other end was measured, controlled. It did not belong to a person so much as to a system, a voice trained to deliver information without inflection, without emotional residue. It identified itself, stated the debt, $2.9 million. Explained that with Nolan's assets frozen and his wife in custody, the liability was now being evaluated against the estate. Then it said something else. It said it was aware that Daniel Harlow was currently a patient at Massachusetts General Hospital. Not Massachusetts General as a system, the campus, the location. It said it hoped his recovery was going well. Then it ended the call. There was no threat. There didn't need to be. They knew where Daniel was. They knew his condition. They knew how to reach me. And they wanted me to understand that knowledge was not accidental. Nolan's arrest had not ended the danger. It had transferred it. The system that had driven him, the structure that had cornered him into believing there was only one viable outcome, was still intact, still operational, still collecting. And now it was looking at me. I called Garrett before I even set the phone down. She responded immediately. Within an hour, a protective detail was outside Daniel's room. "Congratulations," she said when she arrived. That call just became federal evidence. 2 days later, she brought the captivity log, 510 pages, spiral-bound. Nolan's handwriting visible through the cover. The forensic review room at Salem PD had a smell I recognized immediately: printer toner, stale coffee, and concentration. The kind of room where people spend hours confronting things they cannot afford to misunderstand. I opened the log, and I read, Month 1, Daniel's confusion, documented, neutral tone, no commentary. Month 2, the 3-knock pattern, recorded as behavioral, non-threatening. He had categorized it, analyzed it, dismissed it. Month 4, my visits to the basement wall, observed, logged, determined not to interfere with the plan. I stopped for a moment there, not because I didn't understand, but because I understood too well. What kind of man hears his father on the other side of a wall and reduces it to a variable? I kept reading. Month 12, physical condition declining at acceptable rate. Acceptable. Month 15, verbal output reduced. Compliance stable. The language never shifted. Not once. Not toward concern. Not toward doubt. Only toward measurement. The final entry was dated 11 days before Nolan announced his Boston trip. Asset transfer documentation complete. Anticipate resolution within 30 days. Resolution. That was the word he chose. I turned the log face down, pressed my hand against it. I could feel the indentation of the spiral through the paper. Resolution. As if everything Daniel's confinement, Maggie's death, my own erosion could be concluded neatly tied off like an account. But I had already read month 3. It was a single line, easy to miss, buried between 2 longer entries. Subject's father knocked on exterior wall panel, 3 a.m. duration, approximately 15 seconds, non-responsive, no follow-up action required. February 2023. I stared at that line longer than any other. 8 months before Arlo came to fix a pipe. 8 months before the wall opened. 8 months before I understood what I had been standing next to. I had knocked on that wall. Once, in the dark, without knowing what was behind it. And the log recorded it, which meant Daniel had heard it. He had been there, 2 months into captivity, alone, and he had heard me. I sat in that room with that knowledge and realized there are some things you cannot process. You can only carry them. And I did. The recorder's red light was the smallest thing in the room, and yet it held my attention with a force that bordered on obsession. It didn't flicker. It didn't pulse. It simply existed steady, indifferent, like the kind of truth that does not need to announce itself to be undeniable. I found myself staring at it longer than I should have, longer than was reasonable, as if looking away would somehow delay what was about to be said. Everything Maggie had feared, everything Daniel had endured. It was all about to be reduced into something clinical, structured, categorized, numbered. A statement, time-stamped, admissible. That word lingered in my mind longer than the others. Admissible, as if pain required permission to be acknowledged. Garrett had placed the device on the bedside table with a quiet efficiency that suggested he had done this 100 times before, maybe more. Then he stepped outside without a word, closing the door gently behind him. It wasn't courtesy. It was understanding. The kind professionals develop over time, the ability to recognize when a moment requires privacy, not for comfort, but for accuracy. Some truth cannot be spoken in front of witnesses. They need a witness count of 1. I sat beside the bed, lowering myself into the chair, slowly aware of every movement, as though the room itself were recording more than just sound. Daniel was already upright, thinner than I remembered, thinner than I had allowed myself to imagine. His face carried a stillness I hadn't seen before, not the stillness of weakness, but of decision. The kind of stillness that comes when a man has already said everything in his head over and over again, and is simply waiting for the world to catch up. He didn't look at me immediately. He didn't need to. He began with October 2022. His voice was rough, worn down at the edges like something that had been used too often without rest. But it was steady. That was what struck me. Not strong, just steady. The steadiness of repetition, of rehearsal, of someone who had practiced this in the dark for longer than I could measure. Nolan had called him. Daniel said it plainly without emphasis, as if stating the weather. Nolan had told him I was forgetting things, small things at first, then larger ones. That I had asked Nolan to take care of the estate paperwork quietly, discreetly before anything happened to me. Daniel said he remembered feeling relief when he heard that. Relief. That word settled heavily in my chest. Relief that someone had noticed. Relief that someone was handling it. Relief that there was already a plan in motion. He booked the first flight he could find. He arrived on Chestnut Street on a Tuesday. Nolan was waiting at the door. There was a problem in the basement, Nolan had said. Something urgent. Something about water pressure. Something only Daniel could understand because of the old plumbing, because of how we had lived there once, because of things only family remembers. Daniel had believed him. Of course he had. I had never said any of it. Not once, not to anyone. I had never mentioned forgetting things. Never asked Nolan to handle anything. Never expressed concern about the estate. Not privately, not indirectly, not at all. And yet the lie had been constructed with precision, specific enough to feel real, vague enough to avoid immediate contradiction. A lie designed not just to be believed, but to survive long enough to become truth. Because by the time anyone would think to question it, I had already been placed on a medication routine that ensured I appeared exactly as Nolan described. Unreliable, confused, a man in decline, the kind of man whose protest would be dismissed before it was even heard. Daniel walked into that basement carrying a toolbox. He walked out carrying nothing. That was the last moment the outside world saw him for 17 months. He paused there not for effect, but because memory requires space. I didn't interrupt. I didn't move. Even breathing felt intrusive. Then he spoke about the sound. Not the act itself, not the realization, the sound. A single click. He said it wasn't loud. That was what stayed with him. Not loud, not dramatic, just precise, mechanical, final. The kind of sound that does not ask for attention because it doesn't need it. A sound that tells you without explanation that something irreversible has already happened. The room, he said, had been prepared. He used that word carefully. Prepared. A cot, water jugs, a hooded light. Not arranged in panic, not improvised. Prepared. And preparation, I understood, implies time. It implies thought. It implies that the decision had been made long before the moment itself. Not in the hour before, not even in the day before. Months. The same months the asset transfer plan had been revised again and again until it reached its 11th version. I listened. I did not move. 17 months unfolded in his voice without dramatics, without exaggeration, just detail. Footsteps above him mapped within the first week. Patterns, timing. The rhythm of our household learned from below, like a prisoner learning the tides. Nolan's visits 4 in the first 6 months. Short, efficient, clinical. Not the visits of a man checking on someone's well-being, the visits of a man checking variables, gathering data, measuring compliance. Food and water, minimal, calculated, enough to sustain, not enough to comfort. The kind of calculation you make when you are keeping something alive for a reason, not because you care if it lives. Then the visits stopped. After month 7, Daniel said that was when the silence changed. Before it had been observed silence, watch silence. After it became abandoned silence. There is a difference, a profound one. You think you understand betrayal. You think it can be measured money documents, timelines. You are wrong. You do not expect to measure it in the sound of your own footsteps from the other side of a wall. Daniel said he recognized my walk. The slight drag of my left heel when I was tired. A detail so small I had never noticed it myself. But he had. He said he heard it in February 2023, around 3 in the morning. Then one knock. He knocked back. 3 times. He waited. Nothing. He assumed I had gone back to sleep. He waited 306 more days. I held on to that number the way I used to hold on to actuarial tables. Duration against outcome. Except this wasn't data. This was my son. Under my feet. For 306 days after I had been close enough to hear him and failed to understand what I was hearing. In the 4th month, Nolan came down and told him everything. The Mercer Group debt, $2.9 million. The ultimatum, 30 days. And the plan, a clean ending. Daniel repeated that phrase without changing his tone, but something in the room shifted when he said it. A clean ending, as if human lives could be concluded like transactions. He had asked about his mother. Nolan had not answered. He had looked at the wall, then left. That silence answered everything. I felt it settle into me, not as information, but as weight, the kind that does not leave. Before I stood to leave, Daniel reached beneath his pillow. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. Cheap, worn, pressed with pencil so deeply that even where the marks had faded, the indentations remained. Dates, fragments, names, Nolan's full name. He had written it during one of the visits using a pen that had fallen through a gap in the floor above. He had hidden the original in the wall mortar the morning the pipe burst, trusting that whoever broke through would find it. Garrett already had it. Logged, Exhibit 7. This copy, he said, was different. He had kept it inside his left shoe for 17 months. 17 months of darkness. And still he had documented everything. My son had done exactly what I had taught him to do. He handed it to me. The shoe copy is for you, he said. Not for the case, for you. I didn't trust my voice enough to respond. I stepped into the corridor and closed the door carefully behind me. Then I unfolded the paper. Near the bottom, I saw the line. His handwriting. The pencil pressed so hard it had nearly torn the page. A fragment of Nolan's voice recorded from above, Maggie's name, and the word dosage in the same sentence. I folded the paper again, placed it in my breast pocket. At the end of the corridor, Garrett stood waiting. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. In his hands was a folder, marked clearly. Toxicology Second Review. Vanessa signed without reading past the first paragraph, not because she trusted the document, but because she had been waiting for someone to hand her one. Not for clarity, not for truth, for inevitability. There is a particular kind of person who does not seek to understand a system, only to recognize the moment it closes around them. Garrett told me this afterward in the MGH corridor outside Daniel's room, as a fact rather than an observation. I received it the same way. Facts had become the only language I was willing to operate in. The toxicology folder had already been reviewed. The second review confirmed what the tissue samples had implied, what the numbers had quietly insisted, long before anyone was willing to say it aloud. I did not need to read it again. Repetition does not strengthen truth, it only makes it heavier. What I needed was to understand how the pieces still in motion were settling, how the architecture of what had been done was finally revealing its full design. Garrett, as always, began with what she could prove, not what she suspected. Vanessa's cooperation session took 40 minutes. 40 minutes to translate months of silence into a usable record. She delivered 3 accounts Garrett had not yet been able to document. Through physical evidence confirmed the precise captivity timeline against the log entries, and named Ray Caulfield as the contact who had driven Nolan to Portsmouth the night the arrest warrant was signed. Names matter, not because they change what happened, but because they anchor it. They remove the last refuge of abstraction. She was precise and unemotional throughout a woman, offering a controlled inventory rather than a confession. No visible strain, no attempt at absolution. She offered nothing beyond what was directly asked, but what she offered was exact and verifiable, which is the kind of cooperation that prosecutors use and defense attorneys fear. Clean information is dangerous. It leaves no room to negotiate meaning. Garrett recorded every word. I was not present. I did not need to be. I was told only what the record would eventually confirm, and that was sufficient. I had learned by then that being present for every detail does not grant control. It only deepens exposure. The entry that clarified everything came near the end of the session. Garrett asked whether Vanessa had known about the basement before October 2022. Vanessa's answer was, I knew about the plan. I didn't know he'd already started it. That single distinction between knowing the architecture and knowing the implementation told me what every prior appearance of Vanessa had only implied but never confirmed. She had not been recruited after the fact. She had not stumbled into it. She had been there from the design phase, standing at the edge of the blueprint, drawing her own line at the point of execution, which meant every meal she set beside my orange juice, every careful performance of domestic warmth, every practiced expression of concern, every moment of eye contact that suggested alignment. All of it had been constructed on knowledge. Not suspicion, not doubt. Knowledge. There is a difference between someone who discovers a truth too late and someone who arranges their behavior around it. I understood in that moment which category she belonged to. He extended his wrists before they reached the table. The officers exchanged a look. It was noted later in the report as a minor irregularity. It was not minor. A man who surrenders like that has already decided the next move. Compliance in that form is not submission. It is positioning. Nolan was located in a rented Portsmouth kitchen at 6:14 a.m., wearing a bathrobe, a mug of coffee in his right hand. The report specified the brand of the mug. It specified the placement on the counter. It specified the distance from the door. These are the kinds of details that exist so that no one can later claim uncertainty. When the officers entered, he set the mug down carefully on the counter, not dropping it, not startling, not speaking. No visible disruption, no deviation from rhythm. Then he extended both wrists. The arrest report noted the duration 3 minutes and 51 seconds from entry to transport. no resistance, no statement at the scene. I read that report in the MGH corridor and understood immediately why it was more disturbing than any resistance would have been. Resistance is reaction. This was preparation. He had planned for this too. The surrender was managed. It was the behavior of a man who had already identified his next leverage point and was conserving his position until he could use it. People assume control ends at the point of arrest. It does not. It changes form. Garrett brought the interrogation transcript to me that afternoon. Daniel asleep behind the closed door. She set it on the corridor's narrow windowsill and did not comment. She did not need to. She had learned as I had that explanation can dilute impact. I read it standing up. Nolan had described Maggie's death as a necessary first step. He had described Daniel as a complication that required management. Language reveals structure, not emotion, not intention. Structure. When the interrogating officer asked whether he felt remorse, his answer was recorded as, "For the outcome, yes." It didn't conclude correctly. Not that it was wrong, not that it should not have happened, that it did not conclude correctly. Read that again. A necessary first step. A complication that required management, an outcome that failed to conclude properly. He had reduced a life, a relationship, a history to sequencing. He had looked at the woman who raised his children, who kept every birthday, who sat with him through 2 recessions and a failed business and a decade of slow financial disappointment. And he had found a step in her. He had given my wife a category. He had given my son a variable. He had given himself an evaluation metric. I folded the transcript in thirds and handed it back to Garrett without a word. There was nothing to say that the silence did not say more precisely. Some things once understood do not require articulation. I took the elevator to the lobby at 4 in the afternoon because the corridor had become a space I needed to leave, not physically, structurally. It had begun to hold too much. The lobby was wide and ventilated and full of the particular ambient hum of a large hospital. In mid-afternoon, distant PA announcements. The coffee cart I had walked past for days without approaching the low percussion of wheeled equipment on linoleum, the quiet conversations of people negotiating outcomes they could not influence. Life continuing in parallel. I saw Arlo in the corner chair before he saw me. He was sitting with his hands folded in his lap, his work jacket still on. Despite the lobby's warmth, his eyes fixed on a point that did not exist. 20 months. He had carried it for 20 months in a body that keeps score whether you ask it to or not. Time does not pass evenly through guilt. I sat down beside him in the adjacent chair. We did not shake hands. There was no greeting that would have been right for what we both knew. Some recognitions do not require formal acknowledgement. He spoke first. He said she came to me in September. She said if anything happened to her, I was to find you. I waited too long. The sentence held more than its words. Regret does not need expansion. I said you found me, not absolution. Not forgiveness, a statement of fact. There was nothing else to say. There never is when someone has done the right thing 20 months too late and exactly on time. We sat with that for a while, the lobby moving around us the afternoon, shifting in the glass, at the entrance, the quiet evidence of a world that does not pause for individual reckonings. I understood that Arlo's guilt was not a thing I was in a position to resolve for him, and he understood the same about mine, and that this shared unresolved understanding was possibly the only kind of company either of us was capable of at that moment. I heard Daniel's footsteps before I saw him. The measured pace of a man relearning how much space he is permitted to occupy. He came to the foot of the lobby stairs and stopped. He looked at Arlo for the first time. Arlo did not look away. There are moments where recognition happens without introduction. Daniel said she told me about you. She said you'd come. I had never heard this before. I had not known there was a conversation to have heard, which meant Maggie had been preparing more than one of us. Which meant even then, before any of us understood the shape of what was coming, she had already begun to arrange the aftermath. The courtroom smelled of wood polish and forced patience, the same smell as every room where outcomes are decided by people who were not present when the damage was done. I had sat in rooms like this for 40 years, rooms where loss was quantified and distributed and signed off on by professionals who understood the numbers but not the weight behind them. Essex County Superior Court was no different in its architecture. What differed was what sat at the defendant's table. Not a stranger, not a name in a file, but the boy I had once taught how to tie his shoes. Now reduced to a case number and a narrative built from evidence that had outlived every lie he tried to maintain. Prosecutor Callum Riddle, a composed assistant district attorney in his mid-40s, who had spent 4 months building Garrett's evidence into a unified trial narrative, delivered his closing argument without raising his voice once. He did not need to. The captivity log spoke in my son's own handwriting. Daniel's testimony spoke in Daniel's own voice, steady, restrained, each word measured as if saying too much might break something that had only just been put back together. The toxicology reclassification spoke in the county examiner's clinical language, indifferent to human cost, but absolute in its conclusion. Riddle arranged them in the order a jury could follow, without losing the thread, and then he sat down as if nothing further could be added, without diminishing what had already been made undeniable. Judge Harriet Norwood instructed the jury at 11:14 in the morning. They filed out in silence, 12 people carrying a decision that would not change what had happened, but would define what it meant. They returned at 5:47 in the afternoon, not hurried, not delayed, but exactly when they were ready to stop holding the question open. I sat in the gallery between Daniel and an empty chair. I had not chosen that seat by accident. The empty space to my right was not for absence, it was for memory. For the person who should have been there, and whose absence had shaped every step that brought us to this room. The foreman's hands held the verdict form without trembling. I watched those hands because I needed something to fix my eyes on that was not my son's back, not the familiar slope of his shoulders, not the outline I had known since he was a child. On the count of first-degree murder and the death of Margaret Harlow, guilty. The courtroom received it in a silence that was not shock, but released the exhale of a room that has been holding its breath for 9 months. It was the kind of silence that comes when something heavy is finally set down, even if it leaves a mark where it rested. I did not move. Daniel's hand found my arm above the wrist and pressed once firmly, then released not comfort, not reassurance, but acknowledgement. We were both still here. My son was permitted a final statement before sentencing. He stood, adjusted his jacket with both hands, the same small, controlled movement he had used since he was young, when he needed to center himself, and said, "I understand the verdict." Then he sat back down. 4 words. The man had maintained 510 log entries documenting his brother's captivity and spent 4 words on the remainder of his life. I understood what he was doing. I had understood his methods long enough by then to read them even at the end. It was not defeat, and it was not remorse. It was his final managed exit by saying nothing of substance. He gave the room nothing to hold. No grief, no confession, no moment of collapse with which anyone present could feel the satisfaction of having received something honest. No leverage even in the end. He controlled the ending the way he had controlled everything else, right up until the morning a frozen pipe broke open a house he thought he owned completely. Control had always been his language, silence his last sentence in it. I noted it. I filed it. And then I let it go because there was nothing further to do with a man who had used his last public words to refuse the room the truth it was owed. Judge Norwood sentenced him to life without the possibility of parole plus 30 years consecutive. She delivered those words in the same measured tone she had used for every procedural instruction across 9 months of proceedings. No inflation, no drama. The full weight carried by the facts themselves, rather than by the voice reading them. There was a kind of integrity in that restraint. The sentence did not need emphasis. It was already complete. Vanessa received 11 years. Her cooperation entered into the record and weighted accordingly by the court. I did not watch either of them leave the room. I had watched enough. The mathematics were settled. I had nothing further to calculate, and for the first time in months, I allowed myself not to follow the outcome past the point where it no longer required me. Daniel and I walked 3 blocks to an attorney's office on Darby Street, where the estate restoration documents were laid out on a conference table beside a cup of coffee I did not touch. The room was warm, the lighting soft, the kind of place designed to make finality feel orderly. The transfer took 14 minutes. Daniel signed where indicated. I initialed each page. The attorney spoke in careful professional phrases about completion, about effective dates, about closure. Words that belong to systems, not to people. When it was done, he said the estate was complete and effective immediately. Effective immediately. There are phrases that carry more weight than they appear to. That was one of them. We thanked him and stepped back out onto Darby Street into the February cold, where the air felt sharper, more honest, as if it did not pretend to soften anything. I walked home along Chestnut Street alone, taking the route I had walked for 31 years. Familiarity did not comfort me the way it once had. It simply existed unchanged, indifferent to what had happened within it. I passed the house without going in. I slowed, but I did not stop. There was nothing left inside that belonged to me, in the way things had once belonged to me, before belonging became a legal question, before love became a liability someone else tried to liquidate. What had been mine had already been returned piece by piece. Through a basement wall and a hospital corridor and a lobby chair, shared with a man who kept a promise 20 months after the woman who asked him to had died. February in Salem does not announce its intentions. It simply continues gray and indifferent, and absolute the cold, neither deepening nor lifting, the light arriving late and leaving early without apology. I had lived here for 31 years, and I had never found that quality comforting until now. The city owed me nothing, and offered nothing, and asked nothing, and after 14 months of living inside a managed fiction, that indifference felt like the most honest thing in the world. We arrived at Charter Street Cemetery in the mid-afternoon. The three of us, Daniel to my left, Arlo a few steps behind with his hat held in both hands. The sky hung low, not threatening, not clear, just present like everything else that day. I did not arrange this. Garrett told me after the trial what Arlo had said in his formal statement, that in September 2023, Maggie had told him, if anything happened, find Edmund stand behind Daniel and let Edmund speak first. She had planned the positioning. She had known what each person would need to be doing when the time finally came, and she had arranged it months before it arrived. She had written the closing scene of her own story and trusted the three of us to find our marks without a rehearsal. She had been right about every detail of it. I stood at the headstone in the flat gray light and said what I had come to say. You knew before I did. You always knew before I did. I am sorry it took a burst pipe and a good man's guilt to get me there. I am sorry I told you that you were confused. I am sorry I did not write it down when you asked me to. The words did not echo. They did not need to. Then the part she would have recognized, the ledger, settled in the language she had always known me to use when I meant something without reservation. She left me one good son. She left me one honest friend. She left me the knowledge that I had been wrong about the most important thing a man can be wrong about, and that being wrong about it had cost her everything, and that the only thing left to do with that knowledge was to carry it forward and not look away from it. I would not look away from it, not again. We stood there a moment longer than necessary, or perhaps exactly as long as required. There is a difference, but it is not one you can measure from the outside. Then we walked out together. The gate closed behind us with a sound like a file drawer, shutting the soft, final click of a thing properly closed. Not erased, not undone. Closed. I did not look back. The February sky held pale and enormous and indifferent, and we walked back toward the street, and I kept pace with my son, and the cold came in around us the way cold does in Salem without malice, without meaning simply as the truth of where we were and what the season required of us. It was enough. For the first time in a very long time, it was enough. I spent 40 years calculating risk for strangers and never once turned that instrument on my own front door. I trusted, completely questioned nothing, and called it love. This is my family story, and if it teaches you one thing, let it be this. Love without awareness is not protection. It is an open door. Do not make my mistake. The people closest to you are not automatically the safest ones in the room. Presence is not the same as protection. Attention is not the same as suspicion. It is simply the difference between a father who hears 3 knocks and a father who sleeps through them. I slept through them for 14 months. I will carry that for the rest of my life. I believe God allowed me to survive this family betrayal, Not because I deserved it more than Maggie did, but because someone needed to be left standing to speak it aloud. She warned me. She planned for my survival even while she was losing her own fight. She trusted a plumber with a promise and trusted me with a name still left in a phone. That was her final act of love in the middle of a family betrayal that should never have been possible. If this family story found you at the right moment, if something in Edmund's journey mirrors something you have been afraid to look at directly, please do not look away from it. Pay attention to the quiet warnings. Trust the people who show up without being asked. This is my family story, and the lesson inside it is real. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this journey. Leave a comment and tell me what would you have done in Edmund's position. The night you heard 3 knocks at 3 in the morning and your son was sleeping upstairs, I genuinely want to hear how you see it. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. A note before you go: while this story draws from real emotional truths and social themes surrounding family betrayal, certain elements have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this type of content isn't your preference, feel free to explore other videos that suit you better. No hard feelings at all.